I think it's about time I began to demystify borderline personality disorder and other types of personality disorders. As you've probably seen from one of the biggest cases I've seen in probably my lifetime that's been on court, other than O.J. Simpson, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case has brought to the forefront personality disorders, particularly histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. And the stigma is huge, massive. So let's have a look at demystifying it and maybe giving you a bit more compassion towards people who have got personality disorders. If you don't know me already, my name's Laura. I work for my own company called Law of Attraction Life Coaching, and I'm an empowerment coach. I am also a survivor of CPTSD and borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is something that people can manage and heal from to the point of no longer being diagnosed with it. It isn't something like bipolar where you have it and you have it for the rest of your life. This is something that is created through trauma, and when the trauma is healed and those dysfunctional behaviours are remedied, people can get well from personality disorders. You can change the way that you respond to the world. And I think with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case being so well publicised and so well to the forefront, unfortunately, people are creating much more stigma than there already is. And you only need to do a very short Google or a search engine on the internet about borderline, and you'll begin to see actually how much stigma there is. People say online, stay away from borderliners, that borderliners, some people think borderliners should be put in prison, some people are now advocating, I think it's now we're in Canada, that you can have assisted suicide if you're a borderline patient, which is insane. They'd rather kill you than help you. As somebody who's survived her own journey with a personality disorder and is now helping other people to not only deal with narcissistic abuse and other behaviours that have come in toxic relationships, but also working with people with CPTSD that can manifest with the same symptoms as borderline, but also helping just other people to kind of move through some of these murky waters and to become our best selves. Now, are all borderliners toxic, mental, horrendous people that torture other people? No. Are all narcissists toxic, horrible torturers of other human beings? Again, no. Well, something I find interesting is that people who have got personality disorders such as borderline, histrionic or narcissist are kind of thrown in with the same camp. Because it's a cluster by disorder, they're thrown in with people with antisocial personality disorder, which is some of that sociopathy that we would have typically seen. We've also got psychopathic disorders, and this is again they kind of all get thrown in together. And unfortunately, because borderlines often date narcissists, guess who's doing the smear campaign on the borderline? The narcissist. Now, I don't know many people who would advocate going online and smearing their exes because they were borderlines and they've destroyed my life. I'll tell you who often do things like that are narcissists. And so the borderlines tend to get a really, really bad rap because of the fact that they often date narcissists. And why is that? Well, a borderline is not only dysfunctional, but has high levels of empathy. The difference between a borderline and a narcissist is that empathy. The narcissist has almost a kind of sociopathy kind of part to it, where they're not very empathic towards their sources. The borderline is very, very capable of feeling high levels of empathy, and this can cause huge amounts of distress because of the fact that they have dysfunctional patterns, and they not only feel guilty for the dysfunctional patterns, but they also are unable of moving outside of the dysfunctional patterns. The narcissist, however, doesn't really give much of a shit about who gets hurt in the process of them and their dysfunctional patterns. They don't tend to think about the other person. A borderline does. And this is why you'll often find a borderline won't be online smearing their narcissistic ex. They tend to look inwards. Now, the difficulty with these dysfunctional personalities is that they are dysfunctional. And how do they get dysfunctional? Well, through childhood trauma. And when you begin to recognize that, the borderline, the narcissist, the antisocial personality disorder, the histrionics, whatever it is, this is a childhood strategy to fix and to overcome the trauma that they've experienced as a child. Now, for a borderline, some of the main parts of their dysfunction comes with self-harm, with drug addiction, with unconventional coping mechanisms. The main trigger for a borderline is the extreme fear of abandonment. And why are they fearful of abandonment? Because they've been abandoned in childhood, and it scares the shit out of them that this is going to happen again. And why have they created these dysfunctional behaviours? Well, they've created dysfunctional behaviours because they're raised in a dysfunctional environment, and often by dysfunctional parents. A borderline is often the child of a narcissist. And so this borderline child has become it because of the dysfunction of their childhood, and because they haven't learned how to manage or create healthy coping strategies, because their parent is probably very dysfunctional, either an addict of some form or a narcissist of some form, they create unhealthy coping mechanisms. And that's often drug use. It can come out as attention seeking, it can come out as self-harm, it can come out of all of these terrible fears of being abandoned, and they manifest in unhealthy manners. And when you recognize that there's that level of arrested development that comes, and arrested development is where the child's progress stops at some point. When the trauma happens, the unhealthy coping mechanisms step in, but they stop learning. And so the psychology of that person at that time is stuck at the age that the trauma happened. Now, if you haven't got compassion for people who have been abused as children and have come up with really dysfunctional behaviours that unfortunately bleed out onto everybody in their life, but not through malice and not through intention, completely unintentionally, because they're children that haven't been taught healthy coping mechanisms. If you're somebody that doesn't have compassion for those people, I would suggest you go and get checked for your own personality disorder. Because if you don't have compassion for children that have been abused and have come up with some unhealthy mechanisms, what the hell is wrong with you? Now, I'm aware that if you are a person that has been treated badly in a toxic behaviour by somebody else who has a personality disorder or some of these traits, you have also been abused as a result. And I'm aware that your abuse can turn into things like post-traumatic stress disorder. But that is also your responsibility. Just as much as for the borderline, their behaviour is their responsibility, although they were a victim of somebody else, your behaviours are now your responsibility, even though they came at the hands of somebody else. And by having compassion for the person that created these situations with you, you can start to have compassion for yourself. Now, personality disorders are incredibly complex. They're incredibly complex. They create very dysfunctional patterns that, as I said, they bleed out onto everybody and anybody that unfortunately has contact with the person who has a personality disorder. And for the borderline, they are conscious and aware of these behaviours, but they're like stuck. It's a pattern that keeps repeating, and they're almost unable to pull themselves out of it. And they're unable to pull themselves out of it because they don't have any other coping mechanisms to put in place of these unhealthy coping mechanisms. So I don't know if I've said in this video, I think so. I have borderline personality disorder. I also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is because I had a really, really terrible childhood at points. Full of abuse, full of suffering, full of loneliness, abandonment, and I didn't have any healthy coping mechanisms. Now, why did I not have healthy coping mechanisms? Well, because my parents don't have healthy coping mechanisms. my parents were raised by people who didn't have mechanisms that were healthy, and so they didn't develop them themselves. They had a child, well, they had a few children, and unfortunately those unhealthy mechanisms were passed on to us. Now, unless you're lucky enough to have had maybe friends of the family or cousins or uncles or aunts or whomever that could teach you some of those healthy mechanisms, where on earth do you expect these children who are victims of victims to come up with healthy coping mechanisms? Where do we learn them? And who supports you whilst you implement them if you don't have a support network? There's a reason why people become drug addicts and homeless, and there's a reason why a lot of people who have got borderline personality disorder are in that situation. And it's because they suffer from a crushing mental health issue that has come off the back of huge amounts of trauma that has then created very, very dysfunctional ways of living in the world. And it is not their fault. It is their responsibility to fix it, but it isn't their fault. But to fix all of these things takes years and years of therapy and help. And often processes to get through physical health issues like chronic fatigue that comes alongside, like drug addiction that comes alongside, eating disorders. With borderline personality disorder, there are so many other comorbid issues that also need to be checked and dealt with before they can begin to remedy some of the mental health parts. And unfortunately, because there are so many really severe comorbid issues that come with borderline personality, these people tend to be at death's door by the time they start to be fixed. It tends to come with the side of a suicide attempt or with an eating disorder that's got a completely out of place. And unfortunately, due to neurodivergent masking, which is pretending that everything's okay, and if you've grown up in a traumatic household where abuse is happening, you've become an actor. You have been taught often to go into school and say nothing, to pretend everything's okay, that what goes on in the house stays in the house, and that we don't air our dirty laundry outside. And this is wherein lies the cycle continuing, because particularly if you're raised by a narcissists are very, very conscious about how things look. And God forbid that the child would ever break the trust of your narcissistic parent, because your parent is there to keep you surviving. And so for the borderline child, who's often tends to be raised by a narcissistic parent, they will never break the confidences of their parent. They have been trained to be like the military for the parent, and they don't know any better, because that's the only parent that they've had. That's the only experience that they've had. And so these poor children end up going to school and pretending along that everything's fine at home, that there's no problems. And if social services do end up getting involved at some point, the narcissistic parent, the toxic behaviors that go on in the house will be just cleared out. That you have to be, there's a reason why children are killed. You think about some of the high profile cases of children that have been killed in their homes, like Baby P and some of the other children. And these children, they've had social services going into the home. Why are trained professionals not able to spot this? Well, because the narcissist, because people who are also incredibly toxic, they also mask really well. And you will see, most of the time, they'll come into the house and you'll see these people as being the perfect parent. Oh, there's such a good mother, there's such a good father. But the stuff that goes on behind closed doors, you can almost never believe. And unfortunately, sometimes the toxic parents' behavior and acting is so good that a child can come out and say something and the adults don't believe them. They don't believe that this is truthful because it seems so fanciful in comparison to what the parent is projecting. And so these children are left in really traumatic, often violent, often abusive situations, and they're unable to get out. And this is where those really detrimental behaviors start to come in. And borderline tends to come out in teenagehood, where we start to see some of those rebellious actions coming into place. And this is, it's the typical rebellion. It's the sleeping around, sex for validation. I mean, go and look at my channel playlist. I mean, you'll see all the stuff I talk about, and most of the stuff I talk about is stuff that I've done. You'll start to see self-harm, you'll start to see drug use, you'll start to see eating disorders, you'll start to see any possible way that the child can attempt to self-soothe, can attempt to find the love and the acceptance that they haven't had at home. And this can bleed out into the world in what would be deemed as really inappropriate and questionable behaviours. And unfortunately, these questionable behaviours creates this cycle where once again people abandon them. And so it creates this feedback loop of pain and suffering. And because the child doesn't know how to self-soothe in a healthy way, they eat too much, they smoke too much, they take drugs, they use sex, they use whatever they can use to try and self-soothe, to heal that pain, that hole inside of them. And so, they go out and they do these detrimental behaviours, and friends that they may have kept hold of become annoyed by these behaviours. That the person's always on drugs, or that they start to become a bit messy, or that when they drink they break down and they're in floods of tears, and there's madness that surrounds this person. And then people abandon them again. And I completely understand it. I've been through this. I've had friends of mine that have left me because of my own drug addictions. I'm an ex-self-harmer. I've had eating disorders. I've been psychotic, literally suffering from psychosis. Friends and normal people don't know how to deal with this stuff, and so often they just leave you. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but I know how painful that is. So I don't, I was going to say I don't harbour any resentment. I do harbour resentment for people that have used my mental health either against me for their own gain, or who have left me in times that have been required. But I understand it, and I see it from a different perspective. They maybe don't understand it and have just got better boundaries than I do. But the problem is that these children are raised with no knowledge of healthiness. And unfortunately, you as a human being that meets them at 20 or 30 or however old that you are to meet them, and maybe at the unfortunate length of time that they still haven't been able to get the help that is required, you meet them and you just see all of these unhealthy behaviours. You think, oh God, that person's a drug addict. They're always on it. They want to party all the time. They drink too much, that they're too loud, that they're needy of my time. They're needy of my behaviours. Whatever it is that you don't like about them that triggers you because of your healthy coping mechanisms, because of your healthy boundaries. But the vital piece of information that you're missing is that you're dealing with a child who is really fucked up because they've had a terrible childhood that has been full of abuse. And often we don't recognise that. We just want to look at the adult and just go, oh, they're a mess because of them. But there's very few people on this planet who are messes because of them. And I reiterate, it's not their fault, but it is their responsibility. Just because you have a personality disorder, or you have trauma, or you have whatever, it doesn't mean that you have carte blanche to go and destroy people's lives, or to be as toxic as you like. It is not an excuse, it is an explanation. Let me say that again. Your trauma does not mean you can treat anybody however you like. It is not an excuse, it is an explanation. I work really, really hard on a daily basis to try and ensure that I am not the toxic person who I was previously because of a result of my trauma. I do my best on a daily period to be my best self and to put healthy coping mechanisms into my life. But sometimes it falls apart. And you'll have seen this during the pandemic. People's lives began to fall apart because they weren't able to do the healthy coping mechanisms that they originally would have done. Imagine if you've got 20, 30, 40 years of mental health issues as well as normal life to deal with. normal difficulties, deaths, breakdowns, relationships ending. And I see so much stigma online for people who have got personality disorders. And it often comes from a real lack of compassion, and also comes from a real lack of understanding that these people are just broken, they're toxic, that you should stay away from them. And I'll tell you, when I was kind of becoming consciously aware and piecing things together of what my diagnosis actually was, I did Google it, and I wish I hadn't, because it just made me want to kill myself, because it was just that borderline people are toxic, that they're horrible, that you should stay away from them, that if you see one, run in the opposite direction. And it's like, wow, you know, for the person that has got unhealthy coping mechanisms because they were abused as a child, and one of their biggest triggers is abandonment, and then you see that online. And it's always the way, who is it that writes the stuff online about people like that? Do you know how many times I've been in relationships with people who are narcissistic, and never have I thought, I'm just going to write online about what a toxic person that person was, because of my own level of introspection to see what I may have contributed to the situation. And I think if you take a look at stuff online, if you're somebody with borderline personality disorder, or you're doing some research on people with personality disorders, stay the hell off of all of the, you know, Reddit and Quora and wherever people can kind of put their own things. Because the people who tend to write all of these seething, horrible responses and reviews of people that they've had to experience never have the introspection to think, why were you in a relationship with that person in the first place? Why did you allow those behaviors in your life? Why would you pair with somebody else who's got a personality disorder? And the answer to those questions are often because you haven't got boundaries, because you have a personality disorder, that there is something toxic and fundamentally incorrect in your own self. And instead of being introspective and looking at themselves and thinking, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I was part of it too. Takes two to tango. Instead of that, they rather write a diatribe of aggression and hatefulness. So looking at the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, Johnny Depp was in a marriage, and I'm not this. People go, oh, you're victim blaming. It's not victim blaming. It's taking responsibility for our own actions. If we all don't take responsibility for our own actions, then we're all just being victims, and then we need the other person to change before we can change. And that doesn't do anything. That's just waiting and bullshit. Now, people who pair with people with personality disorders are either lured in and love bombed as such by a narcissist, and then by the time they recognize something's going on, they're kind of in it. Now, narcissists tend to date borderlines or people with complex personality, with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the core wounds of I'm not enough. It's the way in. Your trauma is the chink in your armor that allows people in to your life. If you're somebody who is healthy, who has got healthy boundaries, who has got healthy coping mechanisms, you're not gonna date somebody who has got a personality disorder. Because you'll be looking for red flags, you'll have spotted it. You'll see that things don't quite add up. So if you have dated somebody and you think, God, that person was really toxic, you do need to do some work on yourself. And I'm sure I'm going to get a load of people who are really pissed off at this. But I've been in both situations, and I could blame all of my toxic relationships on people on dating narcissists, or I could recognize that I have my own trauma that has led me to be in that situation. And when I take back my power and recognize that the reason that the stuff happened in my life was because of some of my own actions, I can heal it, I can remedy it, I'm empowered. If you want to be a victim, you're on the wrong channel. I'm not a victim of the stuff that I've been through. And a lot of people who've got personality disorders don't really want to be viewed as victims, but we do want to be given a fair chance, and we don't want to be stigmatized as being like Satan, because we're not. We're just people who have had really bad childhoods, who are trying their best. And we're often trying a million times harder than anybody else that I've known. My life has been a process of digging myself out of a grave that I started 12 feet under, and you're all up on the grass having a great time in the sunshine and wondering why I'm behind. If you can't have compassion for people who have been through some of the things that you can't even imagine going through, then you really, really need to take a long, hard look at yourself. Because people who have got a personality disorder, whether it is ASPD or BPD or NPD or HPD, they've gotten that through being abused. It's not something they signed up for. It's not that they wanted. They don't intentionally go out to do these behaviors that are toxic or bad. It's a symptom of the trauma that they've experienced. And if you can honestly sit there with hand on heart and say to me that you've never hurt anybody as a result of your own traumas as a child and throughout your life, whatever it may have been, it could be that your goldfish died and you were horrible to somebody at school. What's the difference? The person that you were picking on had nothing to do with the original trauma, but they're the victim of your behavior because you felt like shit. Have you ever screamed at somebody or shouted at somebody that cut in front of you because of road rage? That person didn't deserve you shouting at them. Ever been rude to somebody in a shop because you were in a rush? We're not all perfect. None of us are. And if you think you are, feel free to make a rebuttal. I'd love to hear how perfect you are and how you don't deserve to have compassion for anybody because you're perfect. If you make a rebuttal, you're probably a narcissist. It's really important that in these times, when personality disorders like this have become at the forefront of one of the biggest cases in the last decade, that we don't just add to more stigma. Other than anorexia, borderline personality disorder has one of the highest suicide rates. And why is that? It's because it's an incredibly complex issue and it's comorbid with so many other issues like drug addiction, like self-harm. And if you think that stigmatizing people with personality disorders is the way to help them, you're insane. You're worse than anybody with a personality disorder. Because what people who have childhood trauma need is understanding, love, strong boundaries, good communication. That's what they need. And they need help. They need lots of help. And if you're in America, unless you're rich, good luck getting that mental health that you need. Good luck getting the psychiatry that you need. Good luck getting the therapy that you need. And even here in the UK, where we can access free healthcare, it's incredibly difficult. At the moment, there's a waiting list of about 10 months where I'm at the moment for therapy. You're paying about £60 to £120 per session for private psychiatry. And most people who have got borderline personality disorder or another personality disorder require weekly for years. And the people that you find on the streets who are drug addicts, who are homeless, who are dysfunctional, they're that way because they were so badly abused often as children that their life has spun out of control. They're not bad people. They don't choose to be there. They didn't want to be there. They had the unfortunate luck of being born to people who were also traumatized. And they never had anybody that stepped in to help them. I wanted to make this video because I want people to understand a little more about why people with personality disorders are the way that they are. How did they end up being that way? So you can have a little bit more compassion, because often what people see is just the end result, which can be somebody who is arrogant or egotistical or has in the ways of narcissism, somebody that cycles through people that has, relationship after relationship after relationship, people who have addiction problems or eating disorder problems, or who have, issues, detrimental behavior, dysfunctional behaviors. And I get it, you know, if you're a healthy person, that's difficult to be around. And fair enough for having those boundaries. I'm not telling you to break down your boundaries and keep people who are dysfunctional in your life. But I am asking you to have more compassion. And I think that when you understand that these people are the way they are, not through any fault of their own, and that often the people that have been unable to get help end up being the worst kinds of people, you know, homeless, criminals. And in the case of Amber Heard, I don't know what her history or background is, but if you are very good at masking, people don't find out that there's something wrong with you until maybe it's quite late. And if you've been raised in a house that is hush hush, keep things secret, you don't go and tell everybody all of these things. There's so much stigma against it. Why would anybody want to out themselves for having mental health? I've lost jobs because of my mental health. The society sets people up to fail. You either fit in with society and the societal norms, or you don't. And if you don't, you're an outlier and nobody cares. You know, once you're homeless, that's a tough route to try and get back into normal society. Sorry, you need an address for that. You need an address for your benefits. You need an address for... When you can detach from perhaps some of the suffering that maybe people with trauma in your life have given to you, and you can look in a balanced and objective way at those people and recognize that they're often children in their minds, and when stressed they revert back to the unhelpful mechanisms that they've learned as children. And the only reason why they're doing that is because they haven't had a healthy guide to tell them how to be any different. You can have more compassion for them. And compassion doesn't mean breaking down your boundaries and allowing that person to do whatever the hell they want to you, but it does mean that you can help them, and that we can break down some of that stigma so people who are suffering can actually go and ask for help without feeling that they're going to be judged. If you're somebody that's suffering from borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, if you're a victim of somebody who has got childhood trauma, if you think that you're not very well yourself, I implore you to reach out to your GP. If you want to send me an email, send me an email. My email address I'll put down here, and I'll answer every email. But if you're somebody who is being abusive towards people who have got really severe mental health issues because you don't understand what the hell you're talking about, you're part of the problem. And you're pretty toxic yourself. I don't know why I made this video, but I wanted to try and demystify some of it. I wanted to try and bring some compassion for people who are already really struggling. I think that Amber Heard is a very abusive person. I think that she's lying. But not all abusive people have a personality disorder, and not all people with personality disorders are abusive. And that's something that we really need to remember when there's the level of stigma that is going on at the moment as a result of cases like the Depp and Heard defamation trial. If you're interested in hearing some more of my perspectives about the case in particular, I'll pop a link up here that you can go and have a look at that video. It's going to be a little bit less somber than this one. I feel like this has been a 30-minute rant, but is something that I'm passionate about and that obviously is very personal to me. And if you're somebody with borderline personality disorder, please maybe take some of I don't know, as some hope for the future. A lot of my detrimental behaviours have gone away. I've been able to hold down jobs. I've been to university. I run my own business now. I help other people now. It's not always, you know, a wonderful time. You know, if I could have lived a normal life, I would have probably chosen that. But I don't know life any other way. And now I'm healthier than I probably have ever been mentally. So there's hope. And if you're struggling, get in touch. I will respond. So yeah, bye everyone.